On a rain-soaked Oregon highway, 58-year-old Ben Torres never imagined that stopping to help a stranger would change everything. The widowed carpenter and volunteer firefighter was just trying to get home after another exhausting day, drowning in medical bills from his son's cancer treatment. When he saw that SUV skid off the embankment, his instincts kicked in. He pulled a woman and her twin children from the wreckage seconds before it burst into flames. The grateful stranger disappeared into the night, and Ben thought that was the end of it. But 3 days later, construction crews arrived in his struggling town with anonymous funding to rebuild their crumbling community center. Ben had no idea the woman he saved was worth billions, or that she was about to turn his world upside down. What happens when an act of simple kindness collides with unimaginable wealth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stack of medical bills on Ben Torres' kitchen table had grown again overnight. He stared at the manila envelope from Providence Medical Center, knowing without opening it that the number inside would steal another piece of his sleep. Coffee maker gurgled to life in the pre-dawn darkness of his modest kitchen. The same sound that had marked the beginning of every day for the past 3 years since Margaret died. Ben's weathered hands wrapped around the warm mug, and he allowed himself 30 seconds to study the framed photograph beside the bills. Margaret smiled back at him from their wedding day, her auburn hair catching the church light, her eyes bright with the kind of hope that seemed impossible now. Next to it sat a smaller frame, holding a more recent picture Danny, at 12, bald from chemotherapy, but grinning beside his hospital bed, holding up a wooden horse Ben had carved for him during one of those endless nights in the waiting room. "Morning, Dad." Danny's voice cracked slightly, the way it had been doing lately, caught between boy and teenager, despite everything his body had endured. He shuffled into the kitchen, wearing his favorite Seahawks jersey, the one that hung loose on his thin frame. "Morning, son. How'd you sleep?" "Good." Danny's automatic response fooled neither of them. Ben had heard him up twice in the night, probably dealing with nausea again. But they'd established an unspoken agreement not to discuss every symptom, every discomfort. The boy needed to feel normal, even when nothing about their life was normal anymore. Ben poured orange juice into Danny's special cup, the one with the non-slip bottom that made it easier for him to hold when his hands shook from the medication. "Dr. Peterson wants to see you Friday." "Just a regular checkup." Danny nodded, already reaching for his backpack. At 13, he'd become an expert at reading between the lines of medical appointments. Regular checkups didn't require the kind of careful tone his father used, but they both pretended otherwise. "I'll pick you up after school. Maybe we can grab dinner at Murphy's after. Can we sit at the counter? I like watching Jerry cook." "Course we can." Ben's throat tightened. Such simple pleasures had become precious negotiations with an uncertain future. "Better get going. Bus'll be here soon." Danny paused at the door, his hand on the backpack strap. "Dad, the Henderson place needs new gutters. I saw Mrs. Henderson talking to Mom about it yesterday." Ben's chest constricted. Danny still talked about his mother in present tense sometimes, as if she might walk through the door with her arms full of groceries and her voice full of plans. "I'll give her a call. Thanks for keeping your eyes open." After Danny left, Ben sat alone with the bills and the silence. The Henderson job would bring in maybe $400, enough to cover groceries and keep the lights on. The medical bills required different math, the kind that made his head spin and his stomach churn. $18,000 in collections, another $32,000 in current charges, and Danny's treatment was far from over. The house felt too quiet without Margaret's voice filling the corners. She'd been the one who could make their cramped kitchen feel like the heart of something bigger, who could turn leftover soup into a celebration. Now the space felt like what it was, a tired man's attempt to hold together a life that kept threatening to fall apart. Ben's phone buzzed with a text from Chief Martinez at the fire station. Truck needs new brake lines. Can you swing by this afternoon? He responded with a thumbs-up emoji, one of the few concessions he'd made to modern technology. The volunteer fire department couldn't afford to pay him, but they kept him busy with repairs and maintenance. It was honest work, the kind that let him sleep at night, despite everything else. The drive to his current job site took him through the heart of Milbrook, Oregon, population 2,847, according to the sign that someone had riddled with BB gun holes. The town sat 43 miles up the coast from Newport, far enough from the tourist traffic to maintain its working-class character, close enough to the ocean that the salt air kept everything slightly damp and rusty. Main Street told the story of a place trying to hang on. Palmer's Hardware had been in the same family for 60 years, but the shelves looked emptier each month. The Milbrook Diner still served the best coffee on the coast, but the lunch crowd had thinned as the mill jobs disappeared. The old community. Center sat like a reproach at the end of Elm Street, its roof green with moss, its windows dark, except for the occasional town meeting that drew maybe 20 people. Ben pulled into the driveway of the Victorian he'd been restoring for the past 6 months. The Kowalski house had been in foreclosure when he'd bought it for a price that reflected its conditioned foundation problems, electrical issues, and a roof that leaked in 3 places. But the bones were good, solid Douglas fir that had weathered a century of coastal storms. With patience and skill, he could turn it into something beautiful again. The work was methodical, requiring the kind of focus that kept other thoughts at bay. Ben measured twice, cut once, following the discipline his father had taught him 30 years ago. Each board placed perfectly, each joint tight and true. The house would outlast him if he did the job right, and that thought brought a satisfaction that had nothing to do with money. His phone rang just after lunch. Ben Torres. Ben, it's Sarah from the school. Danny's fine, but he's not feeling well. Can you pick him up? On my way. The drive to Milbrook Elementary took 8 minutes, but Ben made it in 6. Danny waited in the nurse's office, pale but trying to smile. The nurse, Mrs. Chun, had been treating the Torres family with special kindness since Margaret's death, never making them feel like charity cases despite the payment plans and insurance complications. Just some stomach upset, she said quietly. Probably the medication. He'll be fine with some rest. Danny slept most of the afternoon on the couch, while Ben worked quietly in the kitchen, replacing the cabinet hinges he'd been putting off for months. The domestic routine felt like a small victory against the chaos that threatened to overwhelm them. This was what mattered: the daily care, the small repairs, the quiet presence that said everything would be okay, even when it might not be. Evening brought the familiar ritual of dinner and homework. Though Danny picked at his food and struggled to concentrate on his math problems, Ben sat beside him at the kitchen table, occasionally offering help with fractions, while pretending not to notice when the boy's eyes grew heavy. Dad, do you think Mom knows about what happened the other night? On the highway? Ben set down his coffee cup carefully. What do you mean? The accident. When you saved those people, do you think she knows? The question hung in the air like smoke. Ben had wondered the same thing, had found himself talking to Margaret's photograph that night, trying to explain why he'd been late, why he'd stopped, as if he needed to justify an act of simple decency. I think she knows everything that matters, Ben said finally, and I think she'd be proud. Danny nodded, satisfied with an answer that was both honest and comforting. I'm proud too. Later, after Danny had fallen asleep and Ben had checked on him twice, he sat in his workshop behind the house. The space smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, familiar scents that brought peace. His tools hung in precise order on the pegboard wall, each one maintained with the care of a craftsman who understood that quality work required quality instruments. He pulled out a piece of maple, He'd been saving for a special project and began sketching a jewelry box. Danny's birthday was next month, and despite everything, there would be a celebration. The boy deserved beauty in his life, deserved to know that his father could create something lasting and fine. The wood grain told its own story under his hands, patterns formed by decades of growth and weather. Like the houses he restored, had weathered storms and emerged stronger. There was a lesson in that, he thought, something about endurance and the way ordinary things could become extraordinary with enough care and attention. Ben worked until his eyes grew tired, then locked the shop and walked back to the house. The stack of bills still waited on the kitchen table, but they seemed less threatening now, just another problem to solve with patience and determination. He'd figure it out the way he always did. He had to. Before bed, he checked on Danny one more time, adjusting the blankets and listening to the steady rhythm of his son's breathing. This was what he'd saved from the wreckage of the past 3 years, this quiet moment, this peaceful sleep, this promise that tomorrow would come, and they would face it together. The house settled around them with familiar creaks and sighs, a old building finding its rest. Outside, the Oregon coast fog rolled in from the Pacific, wrapping Milbrook in its cool embrace. Somewhere in the darkness, other families were facing their own struggles, their own hopes and fears. But here, in this moment, Ben Torres had everything that mattered. His son was safe, his tools were sharp, and tomorrow would bring new chances to build something lasting from the pieces of their changed lives. 3 days after the rescue, Ben Torres was replacing rotted siding on the Kowalski house when the convoy arrived. The rumble of heavy equipment cut through the morning quiet of Milbrook like thunder across a clear sky. He looked up from his work to see a procession of trucks turning onto Elm Street flatbeds, carrying lumber, cement mixers, a crane that looked like it belonged in Portland, not their forgotten coastal town. By noon, the old community center was surrounded by organized chaos. Workers in hard hats swarmed the building, their movements precise and purposeful. A temporary fence went up around the perimeter, and signs appeared announcing Milbrook Community Center Renovation Project in fresh blue lettering. Ben walked over during his lunch break, drawn by curiosity and the sound of progress. The building that had sat moldering for 5 years was suddenly alive with possibility. He'd driven past it every day, noting the way the roof sagged a little more each winter, the way the foundation settled and cracked. Now scaffolding rose against its walls like a promise. "Excuse me," he called to a worker directing the crane. "Who's funding this?" A man looked up from his clipboard, his expression polite but guarded. "Anonymous donor." "That's all I know." "Anonymous?" Ben studied the operation with a carpenter's eye. This wasn't a half-measure renovation. They were replacing everything. New roof, new windows, what looked like a complete electrical overhaul. "This has got to cost more than I make in a year," the worker said with a grin. "But the check cleared, and the work orders are solid. We're supposed to have it done in 6 weeks." Ben walked the perimeter, noting details that others might miss. The lumber was top-grade Douglas fir, the kind that cost twice what most contractors used. The workers moved with the efficiency of a crew that had worked together before, their equipment newer and better maintained than what he typically saw on local projects. At Murphy's Diner that evening, the renovation was the only topic of conversation. Ben sat at the counter with Danny, listening to the speculation swirl around them like the steam from Jerry's grill. "I heard it was some tech billionaire," said Mrs. Henderson, stirring sugar into her coffee. "One of those Silicon Valley types looking for a tax write-off." "Could be the state," offered Tom Palmer from the hardware store. "Maybe some grant money finally came through." "State doesn't move that fast," said Chief Martinez, sliding onto the stool beside Ben. "Takes them 6 months to approve a stop sign. This is private money, and lots of it." Danny looked up from his hamburger. "Dad, Didn't you say the lady you helped had a nice car? The conversation quieted. Ben felt the weight of their attention, the way small towns focused on any detail that might solve a mystery. SUV was newer, but lots of people drive nice cars. What kind of SUV? Asked Mrs. Henderson. Ben tried to remember details from that rain-soaked night. Lexus, maybe. Dark color. Had Oregon plates? Rental company sticker? Might have been. Ben was beginning to feel like he was being interrogated. Look, I helped some folks in an accident. That doesn't mean they're connected to this. But even as he said it, he felt the connections forming in his mind. The timing was too convenient, the scope too ambitious for coincidence. Someone with serious money had decided to transform their town, and it had happened exactly 3 days after he'd pulled a woman and her children from a burning car. That night, Ben lay awake thinking about the implications. If the woman he'd saved was behind the renovation, what did that mean? He'd helped her because it was the right thing to do, not because he expected anything in return. The idea that his actions had somehow triggered this windfall made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The next morning brought more surprises. Ben arrived at the Kowalski house to find a delivery truck in the driveway, its driver checking an address on his clipboard. Ben Torres? That's me. Got a delivery for you. Sign here. The boxes contained premium tools, a new circular saw, a router set, drill bits that probably cost more than he typically spent on equipment in a year. The invoice was marked, paid in full, with no indication of who had made the purchase. Ben stared at the tools, beautiful in their precision and quality. Part of him wanted to load them back in the truck, to refuse what felt like charity. But another part recognized their value, understood how they could improve his work, help him provide better for Danny. He kept them. Over the following days, more gifts appeared around town. The elementary school received new playground equipment. The fire station got a donation for new radios. The library found its book budget mysteriously expanded. Each gift arrived without fanfare, without acknowledgement required, as if some invisible hand was quietly improving their lives. Ben found himself studying every out-of-state car that passed through town, looking for clues. He paid attention to strangers in ways he never had before, wondering if one of them might be his mysterious benefactor. The feeling was unsettling, being watched over by someone he couldn't see, couldn't think, couldn't understand. "You're overthinking this," Chief Martinez told him one afternoon as they watched the community center transformation. "Good things happen sometimes. Doesn't mean there's a conspiracy." "This isn't just good things," Ben replied. "This is someone with serious money making decisions about our town. Don't you want to know who? Don't you want to know why?" The chief shrugged. "I want to know our kids will have a safe place to play basketball, and our seniors will have somewhere to meet for their card games. Beyond that, I'm not sure it matters." But it mattered to Ben. He'd built his life on honest work and fair exchanges. You earned what you got, you paid what you owed, and you didn't accept what you hadn't worked for. This felt different, felt like someone was rearranging the fundamental order of things without his consent. The designer watch haunted him most of all. He'd found it the morning after the accident, half buried in the gravel where the SUV had gone off the road. The band was torn, the face cracked, but the underlying quality was unmistakable. This wasn't a department store timepiece. It was the kind of watch that cost more than most people made in a month. He'd kept it, intending to turn it in to the sheriff's office, but somehow never got around to it. Now it sat in his workshop, a tangible reminder of that night and the questions it had raised. The watch was beautiful in its simplicity, elegant without being flashy. It spoke of wealth that didn't need to announce itself, of someone who valued quality over ostentation. Ben picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The back was engraved with initials VK and a date from 3 years ago. A gift, perhaps, or a memorial, the kind of personal item that held meaning beyond its monetary value. he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would take the watch to the sheriff's office. If the woman he'd saved was behind the renovation, if she was still in the area, she would want this back. And maybe, in returning it, he could get some answers about why she'd chosen to turn his simple act of decency into something that felt like a debt he couldn't repay. The community center was taking shape with startling speed. The old roof was gone, replaced by something that looked like it could weather another century of coastal storms. New windows gleamed in the afternoon sun, and the sound of hammers and saws created a rhythm of progress that was both thrilling and unsettling. Ben stood at the fence, watching the transformation, feeling the weight of the watch in his pocket. Change was coming to Milbrook, whether he was ready for it or not. The question was whether he would be able to maintain his footing as the ground shifted beneath his feet, or whether he would find himself swept along by forces he neither understood nor controlled. The sheriff's office in Milbrook occupied half of a converted storefront on Main Street, sharing space with the town's only notary public. Sheriff Davis had held the position for 12 years, long enough to know everyone's business, but wise. Enough to keep most of it to himself. He looked up from his paperwork when Ben walked in, the designer watch heavy in his jacket pocket. "Morning, Ben. What brings you by?" Ben pulled out the watch, setting it carefully on the desk. "Found this at the accident site Tuesday night. Thought someone might be looking for it." Davis picked up the timepiece, whistling softly. "This is nice, real nice. Probably worth more than my truck." He turned it over, noting the engraving. "V.K. ring any bells?" "None. But I'm thinking whoever owns it might be connected to all the construction happening around town." "The community center?" Davis leaned back in his chair. "That's quite a leap, Ben." "Is it?" "Woman gets pulled from a car accident Tuesday night. Anonymous construction crew shows up Friday morning. Timing feels connected." Davis made a note in his incident log. "I'll put out some calls, see if anyone's reported it missing." "But Ben, even if this lady is behind the renovation, what's that to you? Town's getting a new community center out of the deal." Ben struggled to articulate his discomfort. "It feels like charity, like someone decided we needed saving." "Maybe we did." Davis's tone was gentle but firm. "Pride's a fine thing, Ben, but it can blind you to good fortune when it comes your way." Ben left the sheriff's office more unsettled than before. He drove to the hardware store, needing the familiar comfort of tools and materials, things he could understand and control. Tom Palmer looked up from his inventory as Ben entered. "Heard you might know something about our mystery benefactor." Tom said, not bothering with pleasantries. Word traveled fast in a small town. Ben browsed the hand tool section, running his fingers over the handles of chisels and planes. "I helped some folks in an accident. That's all." "Folks are saying the timing's mighty convenient. Folks say a lot of things." Ben selected a wood-handled chisel, testing its balance. The craftsmanship was decent, though not exceptional. He'd owned better tools, back when Margaret was alive and money wasn't quite so tight. Tom leaned against the counter. "You know, my grandfather built half this town back in the 20s. Every house on Maple Street, the old bank building, even parts of the mill. He used to say a man's work was his signature on the world. Didn't matter if anyone knew his name, long as the work stood true." Ben nodded, understanding the message beneath Tom's words. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man." He was. Also said that sometimes good work opens doors you didn't even know were there. Maybe this renovation is one of those doors. That evening, Ben worked in his shop behind the house. The space felt like a sanctuary, filled with the honest smell of wood shavings and the familiar weight of well-used tools. He was carving details into the jewelry box he'd started for Danny's birthday, losing himself in the meditative rhythm of the work. The wooden horse he'd made for his son sat on the workbench, its surface worn smooth by handling. Ben had carved it during those first terrible weeks of Danny's diagnosis, when the hospital waiting rooms became a second home, and idle hands felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. The toy was simple, no fancy details or elaborate design, but it was made with love and attention to every curve and angle. Danny appeared in the doorway, moving quietly in his stocking feet. "What are you making?" "Something special. But it's a surprise, so no peeking." Danny approached the workbench, picking up the wooden horse. "I still have this, you know. In my backpack every day. You don't have to carry it around anymore if you're getting too old for." "I'm not too old." Danny's voice was firm. "Mom always said you put part of yourself into everything you make. So when I carry this, I carry part of you." The words hit Ben harder than he'd expected. He set down his carving, tools, looking at his son with fresh eyes. Danny had grown taller in recent months, his face losing some of its childish roundness despite the effects of his treatment. But his eyes still held the wisdom that came from facing uncertainty with courage. "Your mother was right about that," Ben said quietly. "Every piece of wood has its own character. You just try to bring out what's already there." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, Danny organizing tools while Ben continued his carving. The simple domestic routine felt like a bulwark against the uncertainties swirling around them. Here, in this space filled with sawdust and possibility, they could build something lasting together. "Dad, if someone wanted to do something nice for our town, would that be bad?" Ben paused in his work. "What do you mean?" "Like the community center. Everyone's excited about it, but you seem worried. How do you explain pride to a 13-year-old? How do you talk about the difference between earning something and having it given to you? It's not bad, exactly. It's just complicated. Because you don't like owing people? Something like that." Danny considered this, turning the wooden horse over in his hands. "But you help people all the time. You fixed Mrs. Chun's porch last month, and you didn't charge her anything. You help at the fire station, even though they can't pay you. Maybe someone just wants to help us back." The logic was simple, unencumbered by the adult complications Ben had wrapped around the situation. Maybe Danny was right. Maybe this was just the way kindness worked. You gave what you could, when you could. And sometimes the universe found ways to balance the scales. "You might have a point there, son." Later that night, after Danny had gone to bed, Ben walked to the community center construction site. Security lights illuminated the work area, casting long shadows across the transformed building. The progress was remarkable. What had taken decades to decay was being rebuilt in a matter of weeks. He studied the craftsmanship visible, even in the dim light. Whoever was overseeing this project understood quality. The joints were tight, the materials first-rate, the attention to detail evident in every beam and board. This wasn't charity work. It was artistry applied to community service. Ben thought about Tom Palmer's grandfather, about leaving your signature on the world through honest work. Maybe the mystery benefactor was doing exactly that, signing their name in timber and stone, and the sound of children who would play in this space for years to come. The watch was still at the sheriff's office, waiting for its owner to claim it. But Ben found himself hoping that when she did, he would have the chance to meet her properly, to understand the person who had chosen to transform their town with such quiet generosity. There was a story behind all this, and he was beginning to think it might be worth hearing. Valerie Kent sat in her rental car outside Murphy's Diner, watching the morning rhythms of Milbrook through rain-streaked windows. Her sketch pad lay open on the passenger seat, filled with drawings of the town's weathered buildings and the faces of people who belonged somewhere. The twins were asleep in the back seat, exhausted from 3 weeks of what she'd carefully called their adventure vacation, but what felt more like an elaborate escape from the life she'd built around them. 8-year-old Emma stirred first, her dark hair tangled from sleep. "Are we there yet, Mom?" "We're somewhere," Valerie said, studying the diner. Are you hungry? Jake, Emma's twin by 4 minutes and her opposite in temperament, was instantly alert. I want pancakes. Big ones. With lots of syrup. Valerie smiled at his enthusiasm. For 3 weeks, they'd been eating at diners and small-town cafes, places where the food came with stories and the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. It was exactly the kind of authentic experience she'd been seeking for her children, though she wasn't sure they understood why she'd pulled them away from their private school and structured activities to eat at places that didn't require reservations. The diner's interior was everything she'd hoped for worn vinyl booths, a counter where locals gathered to solve the world's problems, and the kind of genuine warmth that couldn't be manufactured. They took a booth by the window, Emma and Jake studying their menus with the seriousness of food critics. "Can I have chocolate chip pancakes?" Emma asked. "Of course, Jake. Regular pancakes are fine." Jake was the cautious one, preferring familiar foods and predictable routines. The past 3 weeks had been harder on him than on his sister, though he'd been brave about adapting to motel rooms and unfamiliar beds. Their waitress was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and the efficient movements of someone who'd been serving coffee for decades. "You folks just passing through?" "Something like that," Valerie said. "We're exploring the coast. This seems like a nice town." "It is. Quiet, but nice. Got some excitement lately, with the community center getting renovated. Whole town's buzzing about it." Valerie kept her expression carefully neutral. "Oh? Anonymous donor. Can you believe it? Someone with deep pockets decided our old building needed fixing up. Got the whole place torn down to the studs and rebuilding it proper. That's wonderful. It's nice when people give back to communities." The waitress, her name tag read, Donna, nodded enthusiastically. "Course, everyone's trying to figure out who's behind it. Ben Torres thinks it might be connected to some folks he helped in a car accident last week. Pulled a woman and her kids right out of a burning SUV." Valerie's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. That sounds terrifying. Oh, it was. But Ben's good people. Volunteer firefighter, does carpentry work around town. Lost his wife a few years back, raising his boy Danny on his own. That boy's been fighting cancer, poor thing, but Ben never complains. Just keeps working, keeps helping folks. However he can. The guilt that had been Valerie's constant companion for the past week intensified. She'd learned enough about Ben Torres to know he was struggling financially, that her anonymous gifts might be helping him in ways she hadn't intended. But she'd also learned enough to know he was proud, the kind of man who might present charity, even as he needed it. "Mom, you're not eating," Jake observed, cutting his pancakes into precise squares. "I'm fine, sweetie. Just listening to the conversation." Emma had syrup on her chin and joy in her eyes. "This is the best breakfast ever. Can we stay here today?" "We might," Valerie said, making a decision that surprised her. "Would you like that?" "Yes," both twins said in unison, their rare moment of agreement making Valerie laugh. After breakfast, they drove through the town's modest streets. Valerie found herself paying attention to details she'd missed during her first panicked visit, the way gardens were tended despite the economic struggles, the hand-painted signs for local businesses, the playground equipment that was old but well-maintained. This was a community that took care of itself, that found ways to preserve dignity even when resources were scarce. She parked near the community center construction site, letting the twins watch the workers through the car windows. The building was taking shape beautifully, better than she'd dared hope when she'd written the check. The architect she'd hired had understood her vision of space that would serve the community for generations while respecting the character of the town. "Why are they building that?" Emma asked. "Sometimes old buildings need to be fixed up so people can use them again," Valerie explained. "Like when you fix our toys?" Exactly like that. A man emerged from the construction trailer, and Valerie's breath caught. Even from a distance, she recognized Ben Torres. He moved with the confident stride of someone comfortable with physical work, but there was something in his posture that spoke of deeper burdens. He studied the building progress with the eye of a craftsman, noting details that others might miss. "Can we get out and look?" Jake asked. "Not right now. It's not safe with all the construction." But she found herself wanting to get closer, to see Ben Torres' face clearly, to understand the man who had risked his life for strangers. Her memories of that night were fragmented by shock and concussion, but she remembered his calm voice, his steady hands, the way he'd made her feel safe, even as her world was literally on fire. That afternoon, she found a small art supply store in the next town over and bought materials, watercolors, brushes, sketchbooks, colored pencils. It was an impulse purchase, the kind of spontaneous decision that would have horrified her assistant back in Seattle. But something about Milbrook made her want to create, to capture the authentic moments she'd been seeking for her children. "Are you going to paint?" Emma asked, examining the supplies with interest. "I thought we all might. Would you like that?" "I want to paint the pancakes from this morning," Emma declared. "I want to paint the ocean," Jake added, not to be outdone. They spent the evening in their motel room, painting and talking. Emma's pancakes were more purple than golden, and Jake's ocean featured fish that looked suspiciously like dinosaurs. But their joy was infectious. Valerie found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't in months, maybe years. Her own paintings were different careful studies of faces and places, attempts to capture the essence of a community she was beginning to understand. One sketch in particular kept drawing her attention, Ben Torres as she'd seen him that afternoon, his weathered hands pointing out details to a construction worker, his expression serious but patient. She didn't know why she was drawn to this man, this town, this moment in their lives. But something about Milbrook felt like an answer to questions she hadn't known she was asking, questions about authenticity and connection, about the difference between having money and having a home. Tomorrow, she decided, she would find a reason to return to town. Not as the anonymous benefactor, but as Valerie, a woman traveling with her children, looking for something she couldn't quite name, but was beginning to recognize when she saw it. Ben discovered the woman and her children at the community center on a Wednesday morning, sitting on the temporary steps with sketch pads and a thermos of coffee. The woman looked familiar in a way that nagged at him, but he couldn't place where. He might have seen her before. She was attractive in an understated way, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her clothes expensive but not flashy. "Morning," he called out, approaching with the caution of someone who'd learned that strangers in Milbrook usually meant complications. "Good morning." Her voice carried a slight tension, as if she wasn't sure of her welcome. "I hope we're not in the way." The children wanted to draw the construction. Ben studied her face, noting the careful makeup that didn't quite hide the fading bruises around her left eye, the way she held her left shoulder slightly elevated. Car accident, he thought automatically. Recent one. Not in the way at all. "You? Folks visiting? Traveling through?" "I'm Valerie, and these are my children, Emma and Jake." The twins looked up from their drawings, offering shy smiles. They were beautiful children, well cared for, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from security and love. Emma's sketch showed the construction site in vibrant colors, while Jake had focused on drawing the workers in precise detail. "I'm Ben Torres. I do some work around town." "Torres," Valerie repeated, as if testing the name. "That's Spanish, isn't it? My grandfather came from Mexico in the 30s. Worked in the lumber mills until he saved enough to start his own carpentry business." "And you followed in his footsteps?" Ben nodded, studying her with growing curiosity. There was something about her interest that felt more than casual, as if she was collecting information for reasons he couldn't understand. "What about you? What brings you to Milbrook? We're on a road trip." exploring small towns along the coast. Emma and Jake have been doing a school project about communities. It was a reasonable explanation, but something in her tone suggested layers of truth. She wasn't sharing. Ben found himself wanting to know more, drawn by the combination of openness and mystery she presented. You picked a good time to visit. The center's going to be beautiful when they're done. It already is, Emma piped up. Mom, can we help paint when they're ready? Valerie's cheeks colored slightly. I'm sure the workers have professionals for that sort of thing. Actually, Ben said, surprising himself, the town usually volunteers for the finishing work. Paint, landscaping, that kind of thing. Community effort. We'd love to help, Valerie said quickly, if that would be welcome. Course it would. Can I see what you're drawing? Emma held up her sketch proudly. The building blazed with color, surrounded by flowers and children playing. It was optimistic in the way only a child's vision could be, full of life and possibility. Jake's drawing was more technical, showing the crane and scaffolding with careful attention to proportion. I like how they put the beams together, he sighed. It's like a giant puzzle. That's exactly what it is, Ben agreed. Want to see how they do the joints? He spent the next 20 minutes explaining construction techniques to Jake while Emma painted additional flowers around her building. Valerie watched with an expression he couldn't quite read, gratitude mixed with something deeper, sadder. You're very patient with them, she said quietly. I have a son, Danny. He's 13, loves this kind of thing too. Where is he today? School. He hasn't been feeling well lately, so I'm trying to keep him in his routine. Ben hadn't meant to share that much, but something about Valerie invited confidence. I'm sorry. Is it serious? Leukemia. He's been fighting it for 2 years now. The words came easier than they used to, worn smooth by repetition. Valerie's face went very still. That must be terrifying. Some days, but Danny's tough. Tougher than me, most of the time. They fell into comfortable silence, watching the construction crew install new windows. The work was proceeding with remarkable efficiency, each phase completed with precision and care. Ben had to admit the end result would be magnificent, a building worthy of the community it served. Mr. Torres? Emma tugged at his sleeve. Could you show us around town? We want to draw other buildings, too. Ben looked at Valerie, who nodded. If you have time. We don't want to impose. No imposition. I was heading to the hardware store anyway. They walked through Milbrook's modest downtown, Ben pointing out buildings and sharing their histories. The bank had been built in 1923, survived the Depression and 3 major floods. The diner had been in the same family for 40 years. The old movie theater had closed in the 80s, but still showed its original marquee. Valerie asked thoughtful questions, taking notes while her children sketched. She seemed genuinely interested in the town's history, in the way communities evolved and adapted over time. Her questions revealed an understanding of small-town dynamics that suggested more experience than a casual road trip would provide. At Palmer's Hardware, Tom emerged from behind the counter to greet them. Visitors? Valerie and her children. They're documenting small towns along the coast. Tom's face lit up. Well, you picked a good one. We may not be much to look at, but we take care of each other here. I can see that, Valerie said, studying the carefully organized shelves, the handwritten signs, the personal touches that marked this as more than just a business. It's beautiful. You should see it during the Founders' Day festival. Whole town turns out. Ben here usually builds the stage. It's just carpentry, Ben said, embarrassed by the attention. Don't let him fool you, Tom continued. Ben's got magic in his hands, can make wood do things it doesn't want to do. Valerie looked at Ben with renewed interest. You're an artist. I'm a carpenter. Sometimes they're the same thing. That evening, Ben found himself thinking about the encounter as he worked in his shop. There had been something about Valerie that stayed with him, her careful attention to his explanations, the way she'd watched him interact with her children, the sadness that seemed to shadow her, despite her obvious efforts to be present for Emma and Jake. He picked up his wife's wedding ring from where it lay on a chain around his neck, running his thumb over the worn gold band. Margaret had been gone for 3 years, but the ring remained a constant weight against his chest, a reminder of promises made and love lost. Lately, though, the weight had begun to feel less like an anchor and more like a burden. Not because his love for Margaret had diminished, but because life seemed to be presenting new possibilities, new connections that felt disloyal to explore, while he wore her ring like armor against the future. Danny appeared in the doorway, moving quietly. In his stocking feet. Dad? Who were those people you were with today? How did you— Mrs. Chun saw you walking around town. She said the woman was pretty. Ben set down his carving tools. Just visitors. Nice family. Are you going to see them again? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Ben wasn't ready to examine. I don't know, son. Maybe. Danny nodded, as if that answer satisfied him. Mom would want you to be happy, you know. The words hit Ben like a physical blow, gentle but devastating. What makes you say that? Because she loved you. And when you love someone, you want them to be happy, even when you can't be there to see it. Ben looked at his 13-year-old son, wondering when he'd become so wise, so accepting of the complexities that Ben himself struggled to understand. You think about this stuff a lot? Sometimes. Especially when you get that look. What look? Like you're trying to solve a puzzle that doesn't have all its pieces. Ben pulled Danny into a hug, breathing in the familiar scent of his son's shampoo and the lingering hospital smell that never quite went away. You're pretty smart for a kid. I get it from my dad. Later, after Danny had gone to bed, Ben stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the town he'd called home for 38 years. Milbrook was changing, evolving in ways both visible and subtle. The community center was just the beginning. He could feel it in the air, a sense of possibility that hadn't existed a month ago. And somewhere in that change, a woman named Valerie was sketching their stories, documenting their lives with an attention that felt like more than academic interest. Ben found himself hoping she would stay long enough for him to understand what she was really looking for, and whether he might be part of the answer. The corporate contract slipped from Valerie's purse as she was paying for lunch at Murphy's Diner, the folded papers fluttering to the floor beside Ben's table. She didn't notice, focused on managing Emma's questions about why they couldn't have ice cream for lunch and Jake's methodical arrangement of his French fries into geometric patterns. Ben saw the papers fall and bent to retrieve them, catching a glimpse of corporate letterhead before Valerie turned back to their table. You dropped something. Thank you, she said quickly, taking the papers without looking at them. But Ben had seen enough Valdres Technologies, with an address in Seattle and a logo that looked expensive and familiar. The name triggered a memory from the local newspaper's business section, something about environmental technology and government contracts. Ben wasn't sure of the details, but he knew Valdres was significant, the kind of company that made headlines when it announced new initiatives or expansions. Everything okay? He asked, noting the flush in Valerie's cheeks. Fine, just work stuff. Never really goes away, even on vacation. But the explanation felt rehearsed, and Ben found himself studying Valerie with new eyes. The expensive but understated clothes, the way she handled money without counting it, the casual reference to a work project that brought her to small coastal towns. It was starting to add up to something he didn't quite want to believe. That afternoon, while Emma and Jake played on the elementary school playground, Ben excused himself to use the restroom at Palmer's Hardware. Instead, he pulled out his phone and searched for Valdres Technologies. What he found made his stomach drop. Valdres was one of the largest environmental technology companies on the West Coast, specializing in renewable energy systems and sustainable manufacturing. The CEO was listed as Valerie Kent, a woman whose photograph looked remarkably similar to the artist who'd been sketching their town for the past week. The company's estimated value was in the billions. Ben stared at the phone screen, pieces clicking into place with uncomfortable clarity. The timing of the community center renovation. The anonymous donations appearing around town. The way Valerie asked questions that seemed casual, but revealed deep understanding of community dynamics. She wasn't documenting small towns for a school project. She was the mystery benefactor. When he returned to the playground, Valerie was pushing Emma on the swings, while Jake climbed the monkey bars with determined concentration. She looked so normal, so much like any other traveling mother, that Ben almost convinced himself he'd made a mistake. But the corporate contract in his memory was real, and the implications were staggering. "Beautiful afternoon," she said, when he approached. "Yes, it is." Ben studied her face, looking for signs of deception. "Valerie, can I ask you something?" "Of course. What do you really do for work?" The question hung between them, and Ben watched as something shifted in her expression. Not guilt exactly, but the careful calculation of someone deciding how much truth to reveal. "I work in technology. Environmental systems, mostly. Must be interesting work." It can be. Also complicated. Lots of regulations, lots of competing interests. She paused in her pushing, letting Emma's swing slow naturally. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious. You seem to know a lot about how communities work, how projects get funded." Valerie's laugh sounded forced. "I've been involved in some grant work. You pick things up." But Ben could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she avoided direct eye contact. Everything about her body language suggested someone carrying secrets she wasn't ready to share. That evening, Ben called Chief Martinez from his workshop, keeping his voice low so Danny wouldn't overhear from the house. "Ray, what do you know about Valdres Technologies? Big environmental company out of Seattle." "Why?" "Just wondering. They ever do work around here?" "Not that I know of." "Why are you asking about Valdres?" Ben hesitated, not sure how much of his suspicion to share. "Might be connected to our community center project." "You think they're the anonymous donor?" "Maybe. Can you do some checking, quietly?" "Sure. But Ben, what's got you so worked up about this?" "Someone's fixing up our town for free. Most people would call that a blessing. Most people don't mind being someone's charity case." After he hung up, Ben sat in his workshop, trying to process what he'd learned. If Valerie Kent was behind the renovation, if she was worth the kind of money the internet suggested, then his rescue of her and her children had triggered something much larger than simple gratitude. He'd become part of some elaborate philanthropic project, and the thought made him feel manipulated in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The next morning brought unwelcome confirmation. Sheriff Davis called while Ben was having coffee, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering bad news. "Ben, I found the owner of that watch you brought in." "Yeah?" "Valerie Kent, CEO of Valdres Technologies. Her assistant filed a report 3 days ago. Described the watch exactly. Mentioned she'd lost it in a car accident on the Oregon coast." Ben set down his coffee cup carefully. "She coming to pick it up?" "Already did. Stopped by an hour ago with her kids. Nice lady. Seemed real grateful." "You found it." "I bet she did." "Ben, you sound like someone stole your truck. What's eating you?" How could he explain the feeling of being played, of having his simple act of decency turned into something calculated and strategic? "Nothing, Ray. Thanks for letting me know, but it wasn't nothing." Ben spent the morning working on the Kowalski house, his movements sharp and angry as he installed crown molding with more force than necessary. Every nail driven felt like punctuation to his growing resentment. He'd been used, manipulated by someone who thought money could buy gratitude and transform genuine human connection into a business transaction. Around noon, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Ben, this is Valerie. Could we talk? I'm at the diner." He stared at the message, thumb hovering over the delete button. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to let her draw whatever conclusions she wanted from his absence. But another part, the part that had pulled her from a burning car without asking questions, knew he owed himself the truth, whatever it cost. The diner was nearly empty when he arrived. Valerie sat alone in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, her face pale with what like sleepless exhaustion. Emma and Jake were nowhere to be seen. "Where are the children?" he asked, sliding into the seat across from her. "At the library. The librarian offered to let them help with story time." Valerie looked up, her eyes holding a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. "Ben, I know you know." "Know what?" "Who I am. What I do. Why I'm really here." Ben leaned back in the booth, studying her carefully. "Why don't you tell me?" "Because I'm not sure you'll understand. I'm not sure I understand it myself." "Try." Valerie took a shaky breath. 3 weeks ago, my children asked me what poor meant. We were driving past a homeless encampment in Seattle, and Emma wanted to know why those people didn't have houses. I realized I didn't know how to answer her. I've built a fortune creating solutions for environmental problems, but I've never taught my children what it means to struggle, to work for something, to be part of a community that takes care of each other. Ben said nothing, letting her continue. So we left, just packed up and started driving, looking for places where life still meant something beyond stock options and quarterly reports. Places where people knew their neighbors' names and helped each other without expecting profit margins in return. And you found Milbrook? You found us. When you pulled us from that car, when you risked your life for complete strangers, you showed my children something I'd been trying to teach them for weeks. What it looks like when people take care of each other just because it's right. Ben felt his anger wavering, replaced by something more complicated. "So you decided to fix our problems with your checkbook." "I decided to say thank you the only way I knew how." "By making us your project?" Valerie's eyes filled with tears. Trying to give back to a place that gave me hope that my children could grow up understanding what really matters." The honesty in her voice was devastating, cutting through Ben's resentment like a blade through wood grain. But the hurt remained, the feeling that his simple act of decency had been transformed into something he didn't recognize. "Valerie, I don't need your money. This town doesn't need to be saved. I know that now, but 3 weeks ago, all I could see was a way to show my gratitude. I didn't think about how it would feel to be on the receiving end." They sat in silence, the weight of revealed truths settling between them like dust after a demolished building. Outside the diner windows, Milbrook continued its daily rhythms, unaware that the conversation inside was reshaping the foundation of everything that had happened since that rainy night on the highway. The community center opening ceremony was scheduled for Saturday morning, and by Friday evening, Milbrook buzzed with an excitement Ben hadn't felt in years. Main Street was decorated with bunting left over from the 4th of July, and someone had strung lights between the lampposts. The local paper had even sent a photographer from Newport to document the occasion. Ben arrived early to help with the final setup, but found Valerie already there with Emma and Jake, painting a mural on the building's side wall. The children worked with intense concentration, adding details to what appeared to be a celebration of community life families picnicking. Children playing, people working together on various projects. "It's beautiful," he said, approaching cautiously. Their conversation at the diner 2 days earlier had left things unsettled between them. A careful politeness, replacing the easy warmth they'd been building. The children wanted to contribute something permanent, Valerie explained, not looking up from her brushwork. "Something that would be here long after we're gone." The phrase carried weight Ben couldn't ignore. "You're leaving?" Soon. We've been away from Seattle too long. Real life has to resume sometime. Emma looked up from painting a small dog that looked suspiciously like the mutt that hung around Palmer's Hardware. I don't want to go home. I like it here. We all like it here, Jake added, his usual reserve cracking slightly. Why can't we stay? Valerie's paintbrush stilled. Because we have responsibilities. School, work, our life back home. But this feels like home, too. Emma insisted with the logic only children could muster. Ben watched the exchange, noting the pain that flickered across Valerie's face. Whatever her reasons for leaving, they weren't simple ones. Chief Martinez arrived with a bullhorn and a checklist, his usual efficiency ramped up for the occasion. Ben, can you help me set up the podium? And Mrs. Kent, the mayor wants to thank you personally before the ceremony. Valerie went very still. Thank me for the mural? It's a wonderful addition to the building. Of course, the mural. But Ben caught the relief in her voice, the slight relaxation of her shoulders. She'd thought her secret was out, was prepared for public exposure as the community center's benefactor. The fact that she dreaded it told him something important about her motivations. The ceremony began at 10 o'clock with nearly the entire town in attendance. Mayor Phillips, a retired insurance agent who'd held the position for 12 years, stood at the podium with the enthusiasm of someone inaugurating a cathedral rather than a community center. Friends, neighbors, fellow citizens of Milbrook. He began, his voice carrying across the crowd. Today we celebrate not just a building, but a renewal of our community spirit. Through the generosity of an anonymous donor, we have been given a gift that will serve our children and grandchildren for generations to come. Applause rippled through the crowd. Ben stood near the back with Danny, who'd insisted on attending, despite feeling tired from his latest round of treatment. Valerie and her children were positioned closer to the front, Emma and Jake beaming with pride at their mural. But before we cut the ribbon, the mayor continued, I think it's important to acknowledge that gifts like this don't appear from nowhere. Someone with means and heart chose our town, chose to invest in our future. While we may not know their name, we know their character by their actions. Ben watched Valerie shift uncomfortably, her face pale despite the warmth of the morning sun. There's something else we need to acknowledge. A voice called from the crowd. Sheriff Davis stepped forward, holding a folded newspaper. I got this from the county seat this morning. Thought folks should know the whole story. Ben's stomach dropped. The newspaper was open to an article with a headline that made everything crystal clear. Tech CEO Valerie Kent missing after Coast Highway accident. Below, it was a photograph that left no doubt Valerie Kent, described as the founder and CEO of Valdres Technologies, one of the Pacific Northwest's most successful environmental companies. The crowd turned to stare at Valerie, who stood frozen beside her children. Emma and Jake looked confused, sensing the adult tension without understanding its source. Mrs. Kent, the mayor said carefully, is there something you'd like to tell us? Valerie looked at Ben across the crowd, her eyes holding a plea he couldn't interpret. Then she stepped forward, her voice steady despite the obvious cost. Yes, there is. She moved to the podium, the crowd parting to let her pass. Ben found himself holding his breath, uncertain what she would say, how she would explain herself to people who'd welcomed her as a visiting artist and were now learning she was worth more than their entire town's annual budget. My name is Valerie Kent, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the morning air, and I am the person who funded this community center. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some surprised, some pleased, some suspicious. 3 weeks ago, my children and I were in a car accident on Highway 101. We would have died if not for the quick actions of Ben Torres, who risked his own life to pull us from our burning vehicle. All eyes turned to Ben, who felt heat rising in his cheeks. Danny squeezed his arm proudly. But Ben's heroism was just the beginning of what I learned about this community. Over the past week, posing as a traveling artist, I've seen how you take care of each other. How Tom Palmer extends credit to families going through hard times. How the diner provides free meals to anyone who needs them. How volunteers maintain your parks and organize activities for your children. Valerie paused, looking directly at Ben. I've also learned about pride and how charity can feel like an insult to people who've built their lives on honest work and mutual support. The crowd was completely quiet now, hanging on her words. I want to be clear about something. This building isn't charity. It's gratitude. It's my inadequate attempt to repay a debt I can never truly settle. Her voice broke slightly. 3 years ago, I lost my husband in an industrial accident. Since then, I've been raising my children alone, trying to shield them from grief while building a company that would secure their future. Ben felt his anger beginning to shift, replaced by something deeper and more complicated. But in focusing so intensely on their security, I forgot to teach them about community, about the way people can take care of each other without expecting anything in return. Coming here, seeing the way you've rallied around Ben and his son during Danny's illness, watching how you maintain your dignity and help your neighbors even when resources are scarce. It reminded me of lessons I'd forgotten. She gestured. The building behind her. This center isn't about me giving you something you need. It's about you giving my children something they need, an understanding of what it means to belong to a place where people know your name and care about your well-being. The silence stretched until Tom Palmer began clapping slowly. Others joined in, the applause building until it filled the morning air. Ben found himself clapping too, though his emotions were still tangled. Valerie had played a role, had deceived them about her identity and motivations. But her words rang with a truth he couldn't deny. She'd been learning from them as much as giving to them. There's one more thing, Valerie said as the applause died down. In my grief, I've been trying to protect my children from pain by controlling every aspect of their environment. But this week, watching them play with your children, seeing them contribute to your community through their art, I've realized that what they need isn't protection from the world. They need connection to it. She looked at Emma and Jake, who stood bewildered by the adult complexity swirling around them. So I want to ask this community's permission to do something unprecedented. For me to stay, not as a benefactor or a visitor, but as neighbors. I want to establish a regional office for my company here in Milbrook to create jobs and opportunities while learning from the wisdom you've shown me. The proposal hit the crowd like a physical force. Jobs in Milbrook were scarce, and the prospect of economic opportunity was almost too good to believe. But Ben found himself focused on a different detail. Valerie wanted to stay, wanted to become part of the community she'd been studying from the outside. The thought filled him with a mixture of hope and terror he wasn't prepared to examine. Mayor Phillips stepped back to the podium. Well, I think we have a lot to discuss. But right now, we have a community center to dedicate. Mrs. Kent, would you like to do the honors? Valerie shook her head. That should be Ben. None of this would have happened without his courage and kindness. All eyes turned to Ben again. Danny pushed him forward gently. Go on, Dad. You earned this. Ben walked to the podium, taking the large scissors the mayor offered. The red ribbon stretched across the center's entrance, bright and full of promise. As he cut it, the crowd erupted in cheers, and children ran toward the open doors to explore their new space. But Ben barely heard the celebration. He was watching Valerie, trying to understand the woman who turned his simple act of decency into something that might transform his life forever. The phone call came at 3 a.m, 2 weeks after the community center opening. Ben jolted awake to Danny's ringtone, his heart already racing before he was fully conscious. Hospital calls never brought good news, Mr. Torres? This is Dr. Peterson at Providence Medical. Danny's here in the emergency room. His white blood cell count has dropped significantly, and we need to start an aggressive treatment protocol immediately. Ben was pulling on clothes before the doctor finished speaking. How aggressive? Experimental. There's a new therapy that's shown promise, but it's expensive and not covered by your current insurance plan. We're looking at approximately $60,000 for the initial treatment cycle. The number hit Ben like a physical blow. Even with the insurance he carried, even with the payment plans he'd negotiated, $60,000 might as well have been $6 million. How long? Do I have to decide? We need to start within 48 hours for optimal effectiveness. Ben drove to the hospital through empty streets, his mind churning with impossible calculations. He could sell the house, but it wouldn't bring enough and would take too long. He could ask for loans, but who would lend that kind of money to a carpenter already drowning in medical debt? Danny was pale, but alert when Ben reached his room, hooked up to monitors that beeped with mechanical precision. "Hey, Dad. Sorry about the middle of the night thing." "Don't apologize for being sick, son." Ben took Danny's hand, noting how thin it had become. "How are you feeling?" "Tired, but not bad tired. More like I need to sleep tired than sick tired, you know?" Ben nodded, though the distinction felt academic given the circumstances. Dr. Peterson appeared in the doorway, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the direct manner of someone who'd learned to deliver difficult news clearly. "Mr. Torres, can we speak privately?" They walked to a family conference room down the hall, a space Ben had come to know too well over the past 2 years. Dr. Peterson spread out papers and charts, pointing to numbers that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Danny's leukemia has developed resistance to the current treatment protocol. This happens sometimes. The cancer adapts, finds ways to survive. The new therapy targets the resistant cells specifically, but it's still in clinical trials at most facilities. But you think it will work? I think it's our best option. The success rate is encouraging. About 70% of patients show significant improvement within the first month. 70%. Ben tried to find comfort in this statistic, but 30% felt like a chasm wide enough to swallow his son. The cost, I know it's substantial. We have social workers who can help you explore options, payment plans, charity care applications, fundraising possibilities. Ben nodded, though charity care felt like another form of defeat. He'd built his life on self-reliance, on earning what he received and paying what he owed. The idea of his son's life depending on the kindness of strangers was almost harder to accept than the disease itself. He returned to Danny's room and spent the rest of the night in the uncomfortable hospital chair, watching his son sleep and wrestling with options. It all felt inadequate. By morning, he'd made the only decision that mattered. They would find the money somehow, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. Word of Danny's crisis spread through Milbrook with the speed of small-town concern. By the time Ben returned, home to shower and change clothes, his phone was buzzing with offers of help. Tom Palmer called to offer a loan against future carpentry work. Chief Martinez mentioned a firefighter's benevolent fund that might contribute. Even Mrs. Henderson stopped by with a casserole and an envelope containing $200 in crumpled bills. "It's not much," she said apologetically, "but that boy of yours helped me with my groceries all summer. Never would take payment." Ben accepted the money because refusing would have hurt her feelings, but each offering felt like another weight added to a scale already tilted beyond his ability to balance. Valerie found him that afternoon working in his shop, trying to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of measuring and cutting. She knocked on the door frame before entering, moving with the careful approach of someone aware they might not be welcome. "I heard about Danny. I'm so sorry." Ben continued planing a board, the curled shavings falling to the floor in perfect spirals. "He'll be fine. He's tough. I'm sure he will be. But Ben, if you need anything, we'll manage. I know you will." But managing doesn't mean you have to do it alone. Ben set down his plane, finally looking at her directly. Valerie, I appreciate the concern, but this isn't your problem to solve. It doesn't have to be a problem to be something I care about. The words hung between them, loaded with implications Ben wasn't ready to explore. Over the past 2 weeks, since her revelation at the community center opening, they'd developed a careful friendship marked by attraction and wariness in equal measure. She'd established her regional office in the renovated space above Palmer's. Hardware, bringing 3 employees from Seattle and hiring 2 locals. Emma and Jake had started attending Milbrook Elementary, fitting in with the easy adaptability of children. But Ben remained cautious, uncertain about the dynamics of a relationship between a struggling carpenter and a tech company CEO, unsure whether his feelings were genuine or influenced by gratitude and circumstance. The treatment Danny needs, Valerie continued carefully. What would it cost? More than I have. That's not an answer. Ben picked up a piece of sandpaper, running it along the board's edge with unnecessary force. $60,000 for the first cycle, maybe more if they need to extend it. Valerie was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady but determined. Let me help. No. Ben, please listen. I said no. He turned to face her, his frustration finally boiling over. You want to know why? Because I can't spend the rest of my life wondering if you're with me because you care about me or because you feel guilty about the hospital bills you paid. The accusation hit its mark. Valerie's face went pale, her careful composure cracking. Is that what you think? That everything between use is about guilt and obligation? I don't know what to think. 3 weeks ago, you were a stranger. Now you're offering to pay my son's medical bills. That's not a relationship, Valerie. That's a business transaction. And what if Danny dies while you're protecting your pride? The words cut through Ben's anger like a blade, leaving raw truth in their wake. He gripped the edge of his workbench, knuckles white with tension. That's not fair. Neither is watching someone you care about suffer because they're too stubborn to accept help. They stared at each other across the small space, the air thick with unresolved tension and competing truths. Ben wanted to accept her offer, wanted to let someone else carry this burden for once. But accepting would change the fundamental dynamic. Between them would make him dependent in ways that felt dangerous and wrong. I need time to think, he said finally. Time is what Danny doesn't have. 24 hours. Give me that much. Valerie nodded reluctantly. 24 hours. But, Ben, whatever you decide about us, don't let it affect what's best for Danny. After she left, Ben sat alone in his shop as darkness fell around him. The tools on his pegboard reflected the overhead light, familiar shapes that usually brought comfort, but now felt like reminders of inadequacy. His skills, his dedication, his willingness to work 18-hour days, none of it was enough to save his son. His phone buzzed with a text from Chief Martinez. Town council meeting tonight. Emergency session about fundraising for Danny. 7 p.m. at the center. Ben drove to the community center, feeling like he was attending his own funeral. The building that had represented hope and renewal now felt like a monument to his failure to provide for his family. Inside, nearly 50 people filled the main room more than attended most regular council meetings. Mayor Phillips stood at the front, looking uncomfortable with the evening's mission. We all know why we're here. Danny Torres is one of our own, and he needs help that's beyond what any one family should have to handle alone. Ben wanted to sink through the floor. These people, his neighbors, his friends, were gathering to discuss his private financial disaster as if it were a community planning issue. We've set up a fund at the bank, Tom Palmer announced. Already got about 3,000 in commitments. The diner's doing a benefit lunch on Saturday, and the fire department's organizing a raffle. $3,000. Ben felt grateful and humiliated in equal measure. These people were giving what they could, sacrificing their own limited resources to help his son. But $3,000 wouldn't even cover a week of the experimental treatment. "There's something else," Chief Martinez said. "Mrs. Kent has offered to match whatever the community raises, dollar for dollar." All eyes turned to Valerie, who sat in the back row with Emma and Jake beside her. She met Ben's gaze steadily, her expression unreadable. "That's generous," the mayor said carefully. "But we're not looking for charity. This is about community, taking care of its own." "I understand," Valerie replied. "But Danny became part of my children's community when he welcomed them to school. When you care about someone, you help however you can." Ben felt the walls of his self-reliance crumbling. Between the community fundraising and Valerie's matching offer, they might actually reach the $60,000 Danny needed. But accepting would mean acknowledging that his pride mattered less than his son's life. A lesson he should have learned long ago, but had been too stubborn to embrace. The meeting continued around him, but Ben barely heard the details. His hospital bracelet from Danny's earlier admission crinkled in his pocket, a plastic reminder of how many times they'd walked this path together. His son deserved better than a father whose pride was more important than practical solutions. As the meeting broke up, Ben made his decision. It was time to stop fighting help and start accepting hope, regardless of what it cost his dignity. The phone call came at 3 a.m, 2 weeks after the community center opening. Ben jolted awake to Danny's ringtone, his heart already racing before he was fully conscious. "Hospital calls never brought good news, Mr. Torres. This is Dr. Peterson at Providence Medical. Danny's here in the emergency room. His white blood cell count has dropped significantly, and we need to start an aggressive treatment protocol immediately." Ben was pulling on clothes before the doctor finished speaking. "How aggressive?" "Experimental. There's a new therapy that's shown promise, but it's expensive and not covered by your current insurance plan. We're looking at approximately $60,000 for the initial treatment cycle." The number hit Ben like a physical blow. Even with the insurance he carried, even with the payment plans he'd negotiated, $60,000 might as well have been $6 million. "How long do I have to decide?" "We need to start within 48 hours for optimal effectiveness." Ben drove to the hospital through empty streets, his mind churning with impossible calculations. He could sell the house, but it wouldn't bring enough and would take too long. He could ask for loans, but who would lend that kind of money to a carpenter already drowning in medical debt? Danny was pale, but alert when Ben reached his room, hooked up to monitors that beeped with mechanical precision. "Hey, Dad. Sorry about the middle of the night thing. Don't apologize for being sick, son." Ben took Danny's hand, noting how thin it had become. "How are you feeling?" "Tired, but not bad tired. More like I need to sleep tired than sick tired. You know?" Ben nodded, though the distinction felt academic given the circumstances. Dr. Peterson appeared in the doorway, a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and the direct manner of someone who'd learned to deliver difficult news clearly. "Mr. Torres, can we speak privately?" They walked to a family conference room down the hall, a space Ben had come to know too well over the past 2 years. Dr. Peterson spread out papers and charts, pointing to numbers that might as well have been written in a foreign language. "Danny's leukemia has developed resistance to the current treatment protocol. This happens sometimes. The cancer adapts, finds ways to survive. The new therapy targets the resistant cells specifically, but it's still in clinical trials at most facilities." "But you think it will work?" "I think it's our best option. The success rate is encouraging. About 70% of patients show significant improvement within the first month." 70%. Ben tried to find comfort in the statistic, but 30% felt like a chasm wide enough to swallow his son. "The cost, I know it's substantial. We have social workers who can help you explore options, payment plans, charity care applications, fundraising possibilities." Ben nodded, though charity care felt like another form of defeat. He'd built his life on self-reliance, on earning what he received and paying what he owed. The idea of his son's life depending on the kindness of strangers was almost harder to accept than the disease itself. He returned to Danny's room and spent the rest of the night in the uncomfortable hospital chair, watching his son sleep and wrestling with options that all felt inadequate. By morning, he'd made the only decision that mattered. They would find the money somehow, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. Word of Danny's crisis spread through Milbrook with the speed of small-town concern. By the time Ben returned, home to shower and change clothes, his phone was buzzing with offers of help. Tom Palmer called to offer a loan against future carpentry work. Chief Martinez mentioned a firefighter's benevolent fund that might contribute. Even Mrs. Henderson stopped by with a casserole and an envelope containing $200 in crumpled bills. "It's not much," she said apologetically, "but that boy of yours helped me with my groceries all summer. Never would take payment." Ben accepted the money because refusing would have hurt her feelings, but each offering felt like another weight added to a scale already tilted beyond his ability to balance. Valerie found him that afternoon working in his shop, trying to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of measuring and cutting. She knocked on the door frame before entering, moving with the careful approach of someone aware they might not be welcome. "I heard about Danny. I'm so sorry." Ben continued planing a board, the curled shavings falling to the floor in perfect spirals. "He'll be fine. He's tough. I'm sure he will be. But Ben, if you need anything, we'll manage. I know you will." "But managing doesn't mean you have to do it alone." Ben set down his plane, finally looking at her directly. "Valerie, I appreciate the concern, but this isn't your problem to solve. It doesn't have to be a problem to be something I care about." The words hung between them, loaded with implications Ben wasn't ready to explore. Over the past 2 weeks, since her revelation at the community center opening, they'd developed a careful friendship marked by attraction and wariness in equal measure. She'd established her regional office in the renovated space above Palmer's. Hardware, bringing 3 employees from Seattle and hiring 2 locals. Emma and Jake had started attending Milbrook Elementary, fitting in with the easy adaptability of children. But Ben remained cautious, uncertain about the dynamics of a relationship between a struggling carpenter and a tech company CEO, unsure whether his feelings were genuine or influenced by gratitude and circumstance. "The treatment Danny needs," Valerie continued carefully. "What would it cost?" "More than I have." "That's not an answer." Ben picked up a piece of sandpaper, running it along the board's edge with unnecessary force. $60,000 for the first cycle, maybe more if they need to extend it. Valerie was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady but determined. "Let me help." "No." "Ben, please listen." I said no. He turned to face her, his frustration finally boiling over. "You want to know why?" "Because I can't spend the rest of my life wondering if you're with me because you care about me or because you feel guilty about the hospital bills you paid." The accusation hit its mark. Valerie's face went pale, her careful composure cracking. "Is that what you think? That everything between us is about guilt and obligation? I don't know what to think. 3 weeks ago, you were a stranger. Now you're offering to pay my son's medical bills. That's not a relationship, Valerie. That's a business transaction. And what if Danny dies while you're protecting your pride?" The words cut through Ben's anger like a blade, leaving raw truth in their wake. He gripped the edge of his workbench, knuckles white with tension. "That's not fair. Neither is watching someone you care about suffer because they're too stubborn to accept help." They stared at each other across the small space, the air thick with unresolved tension and competing truths. Ben wanted to accept her offer, wanted to let someone else carry this burden for once. But accepting would change the fundamental dynamic. Between them would make him dependent in ways that felt dangerous and wrong. "I need time to think," he said finally. Time is what Danny doesn't have. 24 hours. Give me that much. Valerie nodded reluctantly. 24 hours. But, Ben, whatever you decide about us, don't let it affect what's best for Danny. After she left, Ben sat alone in his shop as darkness fell around him. The tools on his pegboard reflected the overhead light, familiar shapes that usually brought comfort, but now felt like reminders of inadequacy. His skills, his dedication, his willingness to work 18-hour days, none of it was enough to save his son. His phone buzzed with a text from Chief Martinez. "Town council meeting tonight. Emergency session about fundraising for Danny. 7 p.m. at the center." Ben drove to the community center, feeling like he was attending his own funeral. The building that had represented hope and renewal now felt like a monument to his failure to provide for his family. Inside, nearly 50 people filled the main room more than attended most regular council meetings. Mayor Phillips stood at the front, looking uncomfortable with the evening's mission. "We all know why we're here. Danny Torres is one of our own, and he needs help that's beyond what any one family should have to handle alone." Ben wanted to sink through the floor. These people, his neighbors, his friends, were gathering to discuss his private financial disaster as if it were a community planning issue. "We've set up a fund at the bank," Tom Palmer announced. "Already got about 3,000 in commitments. The diner's doing a benefit lunch on Saturday, and the fire department's organizing a raffle. $3,000. Ben felt grateful and humiliated in equal measure. These people were giving what they could, sacrificing their own limited resources to help his son. But $3,000 wouldn't even cover a week of the experimental treatment. "There's something else," Chief Martinez said. "Mrs. Kent has offered to match whatever the community raises, dollar for dollar." All eyes turned to Valerie, who sat in the back row with Emma and Jake beside her. She met Ben's gaze steadily, her expression unreadable. "That's generous," the mayor said carefully, "but we're not looking for charity. This is about community, taking care of its own." "I understand," Valerie replied. "But Danny became part of my children's community when he welcomed them to school. When you care about someone, you help however you can." Ben felt the walls of his self-reliance crumbling. Between the community fundraising and Valerie's matching offer, they might actually reach the $60,000 Danny needed. But accepting would mean acknowledging that his pride mattered less than his son's life, a lesson he should have learned long ago, but had been too stubborn to embrace. The meeting continued around him, but Ben barely heard the details. His hospital bracelet from Danny's earlier admission crinkled in his pocket, a plastic reminder of how many times they'd walked this path together. His son deserved better than a father whose pride was more important than practical solutions. As the meeting broke up, Ben made his decision. It was time to stop fighting help and start accepting hope, regardless of what it cost his dignity. The fire department radio crackled to life just as Ben was leaving the community center, the static cutting through the evening air like a blade. Chief Martinez's voice came through clear and urgent. "All available units to Riverside Road. Structure: fire with possible entrapment. Ben, you copy?" Ben keyed his radio automatically, muscle memory taking over despite his emotional exhaustion. "Copy, Chief," en route. He ran to his truck, the familiar adrenaline surge pushing aside the weight of the evening's discussions about fundraising and charity and impossible choices. This was something he understood, something he could control through skill and determination rather than the generosity of others. The Riverside Road address sent ice through his veins. The old Yamamoto place, where an elderly couple lived alone with their adult daughter, who had Down syndrome. Ben had done electrical work there 2 years ago. Noting the house's age and the challenges of updating systems in a structure built when fire codes were more suggestions than requirements. Smoke was visible from a mile away, a black column rising against the star-filled sky. Ben pushed his truck faster and was safe on the winding coastal road, his hands steady on the wheel despite the urgency hammering in his chest. The scene that greeted him was chaos contained by training. 2 fire trucks from Milbrook and 1 from the neighboring district formed a semicircle around the burning house. Flames engulfed the rear section where the kitchen had been, orange tongues licking hungrily at the night sky. Chief Martinez appeared at Ben's elbow as he pulled on his gear. Tom and Susan Yamamoto got out safe, but they can't find Keiko. She was in her room when the fire started, but smoke's too thick to see anything. Ben's stomach dropped. Keiko Yamamoto was 28, but functioned at the level of a much younger person. In a crisis, she might hide rather than flee, might become confused and disoriented by smoke and noise. Where's her room? Front of the house, 2nd floor. Windows probably her best exit, but she's scared of heights. Ben studied the building with the calculating eye of someone who'd spent his life understanding how structures worked and failed. The staircase would be compromised by smoke, possibly by fire damage to the supporting walls. But the old Victorians' construction was solid, thick timber framing that would resist collapse longer than modern building methods. "I'm going in through the front," he announced, checking his breathing apparatus. Ben negative, too risky. "We'll get a ladder to her window." "She won't come down a ladder." "You know Keiko should be too scared to move." Ben was already heading toward the front door, his gear heavy but familiar. "Give me 5 minutes." The interior of the house was a maze of smoke and heat, visibility reduced to arm's length despite his flashlight. Ben moved by memory and instinct, recalling the layout from his previous work. The stairs creaked ominously under his weight, but the handrail held firm. "Keiko," he called, his voice muffled by the breathing mask. "Keiko, it's Ben Torres. I'm here to help you." A faint response came from the end of the hallway, not words, but the sound of someone crying. Ben followed the noise, testing each floorboard before committing his full weight. The smoke was thicker here, but the flames hadn't reached this section yet. He found Keiko huddled in her closet, clutching a stuffed animal and shaking with terror. Her eyes were wide with panic, but she recognized Ben through the smoke and fear. "Ben, I can't find Mama." "Your Mama's safe, Keiko. She's outside waiting for you. But we need to go now, okay?" Keiko nodded, but didn't move. Ben knew better than to rush her sudden movements might trigger more panic. Instead, he knelt to her level, keeping his voice calm despite the growing heat and the ominous creaking from elsewhere in the house. "Remember when I fixed your light switch? You helped me by holding the flashlight. I was a good helper. You were the best helper. Now I need you to be my helper again. Can you hold on tight while I carry you downstairs?" This time she nodded, with more conviction. Ben scooped her up, noting how light she felt, how vulnerable. The trip back through the smoke-filled house felt like miles, each step calculated to avoid weak spots in the increasingly unstable structure. The front door appeared through the haze like salvation. Ben pushed through it into the cool night air, Keiko still clinging to his neck. The crowd of neighbors and emergency responders erupted in cheers as they emerged, but Ben barely heard them. He was focused on getting Keiko to the waiting ambulance, ensuring she received proper care for smoke inhalation. "Ben!" Valerie's voice cut through the noise. She was standing with Emma and Jake near the fire trucks, her face pale with worry. "Are you all right?" He nodded, suddenly aware of his own exhaustion and the way his hands were shaking now that the crisis had passed. Keiko was safe with the paramedics, her parents reunited with their daughter. The house would be a total loss, but the family was intact. "That was incredible," Valerie said quietly, approaching as Ben stripped off his gear. "The way you went in there, the way you handled Keiko's fear. Just doing my job." No, that was something more than a job. That was courage. Ben looked at her, seeing something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Not gratitude or obligation, but genuine admiration for who he was rather than what he'd done for her. Anyone would have. No, they wouldn't. And that's what makes you extraordinary. Around them, the community was rallying to help the Yamamoto family, offering temporary housing and clothing, organizing support with the same efficiency they'd shown in fundraising for Danny. Watching them work together, Ben realized something had shifted inside him during those terrifying minutes in the burning house. He'd spent weeks wrestling with pride and independence, afraid that accepting help would somehow diminish him. But watching Keiko's parents embrace their daughter, seeing the relief and gratitude in their faces, he understood something fundamental about community. Helping and being helped weren't transactions. They were expressions of connection, ways people demonstrated that they mattered to each other. For the first time since Danny's diagnosis had thrown their lives into chaos, Ben felt ready to accept what was being offered, not as charity, but as the natural response of people who cared about each other's well-being. The letter was waiting in Ben's sock drawer, exactly where Margaret had said would be in the note she'd left with her jewelry. He'd avoided opening it for 3 years, too afraid of what her final words might contain, too uncertain whether he was ready to hear them. But tonight, after the fire and the community meeting and Valerie's quiet declaration of admiration, he felt strong enough to face whatever message his wife had left behind. Danny was asleep, exhausted from his hospital. Stay but stable enough to come home while they waited for the treatment decision. Ben sat in his bedroom with the unopened envelope, Margaret's handwriting familiar and precious on the cream-colored paper. "My dearest Ben," it began, and he could hear her voice in every word. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've finally found the courage to hear what I need to tell you. I know you, my stubborn, wonderful man. You've probably been carrying guilt and loneliness like they were treasures instead of burdens. First, about Danny. You are already the father he needs, even if you don't believe it yet. Your strength isn't in never falling down. It's in getting back up, in showing him that love means fighting for the people who matter. Don't try to be perfect for him. Just be present, be honest, and let him see that real men ask for help when they need it. Second, about our life together. Every moment was a gift, even the difficult ones. The way you held my hand during chemotherapy, the jokes you told to make me laugh when I felt too sick to smile, the plans we made even when we both knew we might not have time to fulfill them. That was love in its purest form. Don't dishonor that by thinking you failed me. You gave me everything I needed, right up to the end. And finally, about your future. I know you think loving someone else would be betraying what we had, but Ben, that's not how love works. Love doesn't diminish when it's shared, it multiplies. The capacity for connection you showed me doesn't die just because I did. It's still there, waiting for someone worthy of what you have to offer. I want you to fall in love again. I want you to find someone who sees your kindness and your strength, who appreciates your terrible jokes and your patient way with broken things. I want Danny to see that love can survive loss, that opening your heart again isn't about forgetting the past, but about honoring it by choosing hope over fear. You'll know when you've found the right person. She'll challenge you the way I did, support you when you need it, and love Danny not because she has to, but because she sees what I see in him, your goodness reflected in smaller hands and a younger voice. When that time comes, don't hesitate. Don't let guilt or loyalty to my memory hold you back from the happiness you deserve. Take off the ring you've been wearing around your neck and put it somewhere safe with our other treasures. Then take her hand and build something new, something that honors what we had by showing that you learned how to love completely. Be happy, my darling man. Be gloriously, messily, completely happy. That's not just my wish for you. It's my dying request. All my love, always and forever. Margaret P.S. I hid the good tools in the back of the shop behind the paint cans. Use them to build something beautiful. Ben read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face as Margaret's voice seemed to fill the room. She'd known him so well, had anticipated the prison of loyalty he'd build around himself. But more than that, she'd given him permission to live fully again, to love without reservation or guilt. He walked to his workshop and found the tools. She'd mentioned premium chisels and planes he'd bought for a special project, but had never used after her diagnosis. She'd hidden them like a promise, a belief that he would someday be ready to create something beautiful again. The next morning, Ben drove to the hospital with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Danny was scheduled for another consultation about the experimental treatment, but Ben already knew what his answer would be. They would accept the help from the community, from Valerie, from anyone willing to offer it. Danny's life was worth more than his father's pride. "Dad," Danny said as they walked through the hospital corridors, "you seem different today." "How so?" "Less worried, more like you used to be before Mom got sick." Ben squeezed his son's hand. "I got some good advice last night. From someone who loves us both." Danny nodded as if this made perfect sense. Mom always knew the right things to say. After the consultation, where they formally agreed to the treatment protocol, Ben called Valerie. Her voice was cautious when she answered, uncertain what his decision might be. "I want to accept your offer," he said without preamble, "for Danny's treatment. And I want to discuss terms that feel fair to both of us." The relief in her voice was audible. "Of course. Whatever you need. Can you meet me at the community center this afternoon? There's something I want to show you." She arrived to find Ben working on a new project in the center's workshop space. Rocking chair crafted from the rescued Douglas fir, its lines clean and elegant. He worked with the precision of someone who'd found his rhythm again, each cut deliberate and sure. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers along the smooth armrest. "It's for you. A proper thank you, made with my hands instead of just my words." Valerie's eyes filled with tears. "Ben, you don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do. And I need to tell you something else." He set down his tools and faced her directly. "I'm falling in love with you. Not because of what you've done for Danny, not out of gratitude or obligation, but because of who you are when you think no one's watching. Because you see this town the way I do, as a place worth investing in. Because your children make Danny laugh, and because you make me want to build something lasting again." The words hung between them, honest and unguarded. Valerie stepped closer, close enough that he could see the hope and fear warring in her expression. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered, "but I'm scared. I'm scared of wanting something. This much, of risking my heart again." "Then we'll be scared together," Ben said, taking her hands in his calloused ones. "And we'll build something beautiful anyway." The bronze plaque beside the community center's entrance gleamed in the autumn sunlight. Its inscription simple and permanent: "The Margaret Torres Community Center, where love builds community." Ben had insisted on the dedication, wanting Margaret's memory to be part of the building that had brought so much change to their lives. 6 months had transformed more than just the building. Danny sat at a picnic table nearby, his color healthy and his energy restored, teaching Emma and Jake how to whittle small animals from pieces of scrap wood. The experimental treatment had worked better than anyone had dared hope. His latest blood work showed no detectable cancer cells, and Dr. Peterson was cautiously optimistic about his long-term prognosis. "The trick is to let the wood tell you what it wants to be," Danny explained with the patience of someone who'd learned from a master craftsman. "See how this piece has a grain that looks like flowing water? It wants to be a fish." Emma nodded seriously, her tongue poking out in concentration as she worked her small knife. Jake, ever methodical, had sketched his intended creation before making the first cut. Ben watched them from across the yard, marveling at how naturally they'd become siblings. Danny had embraced his role as big brother with enthusiasm, and the twins had brought a likeness to his recovery that no medicine could have provided. The rehearsal dinner decorations looked perfect, Valerie said, appearing at his elbow with 2 cups of coffee. She'd been managing the wedding preparations with the same attention to detail she brought to business projects, though this felt infinitely more important than quarterly reports or product launches. The community center had been transformed. For the occasion, tables dotted the main room, decorated with wildflowers from the coastal meadows and centerpieces crafted from driftwood Ben had collected during long walks on the beach. Tomorrow, the same space would host their wedding ceremony, surrounded by the friends and neighbors who'd become family over the past months. "Are you nervous?" Valerie asked, settling beside him on the steps where they'd first talked about her deception and his pride. "Terrified," Ben admitted, but the good kind of terrified, like standing at the edge of something wonderful. Valdez Technology's Milbrook office had exceeded all expectations, bringing 12 jobs to the town and partnering with local contractors for a sustainable housing project that would serve as a model for coastal communities. But more than that, Valerie had found the authentic life she'd been seeking for her children. Emma and Jake thrived in Milbrook schools, their days filled with genuine friendships and the kind of adventures that couldn't be scheduled or purchased. "Tom Palmer wants to know if you've decided about the business partnership," Valerie said, referring to the proposal that had been occupying Ben's thoughts for weeks. Tom had approached him about expanding the hardware store to include a custom furniture workshop with Ben as the primary craftsman and part owner. It would mean steady income doing work he loved, creating pieces that would last for generations. The partnership felt like validation of everything he'd built in Milbrook: reputation, skill, and the trust of people who valued quality over convenience. "I think we should do it," Ben said. "It feels right. Like everything else that's happened since that night on the highway." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children and listening to the sounds of a community preparing for celebration. Chief Martinez was testing the sound system with the same seriousness he brought to equipment checks at the fire station. Mrs. Henderson and a crew of volunteers were arranging flowers with the precision of military strategists. Even Sheriff Davis had volunteered to direct parking, a role that made him feel more useful than writing speeding tickets for the occasional tourist. "I have something for you," Valerie said, pulling a small wrapped package from her pocket, an early wedding gift. Inside was a compass, its brass surface warm and substantial in Ben's palm. The inscription read, "For the man who always finds his way home. V.K." "It's beautiful," Ben said, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "But I already know where home is." "Where's that?" "Wherever you and the kids are. Geography's just details." Valerie kissed him then, soft and certain, tasting like coffee and promises. 6 months ago, she'd been a stranger fleeing her own life, and he'd been a man drowning in grief and responsibility. Now they were building something together that honored their individual histories while creating space for shared dreams. 5 minutes. Chief Martinez called from inside the center. "We need the wedding party for the final rehearsal." The ceremony rehearsal was wonderfully chaotic, with Danny and the twins arguing about proper flower petal distribution techniques, while Mayor Phillips practiced his efficient duties with the gravity of someone conducting a state funeral. Ben and Valerie held hands through it all, grinning at the organized confusion that would somehow transform into a beautiful wedding by tomorrow. Afternoon dot, as the evening wound down and the last volunteers headed home, Ben found himself alone in the community center with Margaret's plaque. He touched the bronze letters of her name, feeling the familiar ache of missing her tempered by gratitude for the time they'd shared. "I think you'd like her," he said quietly. "She's stubborn like you were, but in different ways. And she loves Danny almost as much as you did." The building settled around him with familiar creaks and sighs, a sound that had become as comforting as Margaret's breathing once was. Tomorrow, This same space would witness his marriage to Valerie, officiated by friends and witnessed by a community that had embraced them both. Ben locked the center and walked home through streets he'd traveled for 38 years, but which felt different, now charged with possibility and promise. The medical bills were manageable with Danny's treatment covered, and Valerie's business providing steady income. The house was full of laughter, and the controlled chaos of 3 children finding their rhythm as siblings. Most importantly, he was building again, not just furniture and community projects, but a life that honored everything he'd learned about. Love and loss and the courage required to choose hope over fear. The October air carried the scent of salt and changing leaves, the Pacific's eternal rhythm mixing with the seasonal promise of transformation. Tomorrow would bring new vows and new beginnings, but tonight, Ben Torres was exactly where he belonged, home. In every sense that mattered, surrounded by love that had grown from simple kindness into something lasting and true.